He slammed the door and said, "Leave." I stayed silent until the lawyer arrived the next morning. The remote clicked off. The television faded out into the quiet that always came between commercials and the next program, the kind of pause that is its own small mercy. Derek stood in the doorway, mid-gesture, reddening where anger had wasted itself into volume. He said it again, closer this time. "Go to your room, old woman." The words were meant to scrape like sand. They landed instead like pebbles in a bowl and settled. I did not answer. I set the remote on the small table beside the green velvet armchair, the velvet that had taken my son-in-law's elbows long before he took to telling me where I belonged. The scent of peach cobbler lingered from the pie Lena had brought over earlier that afternoon, spiced, forgiving, and it filled the room like a small proof that life continued in ordinary ways, regardless of anyone shouting. There are a few gestures that reset the rest of a person's evening. For me, it was not raising my voice. It was opening the drawer by the armchair, where the deed lay folded in an envelope that had outlived 4 administrations and 1 mortgage payoff. It had lived by habit there, near my reading glasses and the small brass key that still opened the cedar chest my husband had made. I slid the envelope out as if retrieving a memory. The sound of the paper against my thumbnail was quieter than the slam of the front door, but in its own way, it was louder. You might expect drama after a line like that. You might expect I followed him into the hallway and matched fury with fury, or that I cried or called Lena names or slammed doors in return. Instead, I walked to the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and took my time. I made myself a cup of tea in the kettle with the amaretto tin that still had a little of my husband's stash. I sat at the vanity and smoothed my hair into a neat bun, small acts of arrangement that helped set a mind into order, and then I laid the papers out on the bed. The deed was not a talisman, it was a record. I had spent 32 years in the county recorder's office, and the grammar of those documents were in my bones. Dates, names, signatures. I knew what they said, and I knew what they meant. Owning a house at my age is less about bragging rights and more about the freedom to stand and say, in a voice that is only arithmetic and ink, "This is mine." That evening, when someone told me to leave, I answered with paper. When the anger ebbs, people often ask me if I felt fear. I did. It was a thread under everything. But alongside it was a steadier current I recognized. The same practical, unflashing composure that had kept my head when I watched strangers file documents at the counter and families sign to keep a piece of their lives intact. Old habits are useful when the world decides to test them. I made 2 calls that night. The first was to Andrew V. Sterling. Andrew and I had worked cases across desks and cubicles when I recorded land transactions. He had a manner that could be all blade under silk. He also had a way with facts that made people accept them calmly, even the ones that hurt. I told him, as plainly as I could, what had happened. The door slam, the words, the years of living in my house, and that the deed was in my hand. I did not beg for counsel. I asked for partnership. Andrew listened and asked the questions that matter. Who was on the title? Who had access to accounts? Whether there were any powers of attorney or signed forms I had not read. I answered. I told him about a few checks that had cleared last month, the wire that had gone missing from the so-called savings Derek claimed were for emergencies. I told him about Lena's hesitance, about the times I'd found my own credit linked to conveniences I had never requested. He said quietly, "We'll prepare a notice terminating gratuitous use. We'll need to serve it in the morning." He did not say the words dramatized. He said the words like a carpenter measuring. I agreed. The second call was to Lena. I had carried my phone in the robe pocket like other women carry small talismans, but I did not expect to need it until I had a plan. She answered with the tremor of someone still recovering from a bruise you cannot see. She sounded like the daughter I had raised, and like a woman who had been married into patterns that take time to undo. "Mama," she said, and it was a plea and a question in one. I told her I was fine. I told her I was going to sleep. I did not tell her I had already called a lawyer. That would have been indulgent. Better to let the legal plan breathe on its own. I lay awake that night longer than I have in years, not because I was rattled, but because my mind had to move through practical checks. Where were the deeds? What were the passwords? Which bank had power of attorney papers? Whether there were credit cards listed under my name but used by someone else. The recorder in me could not rest until the ledger balanced, even if the balance was simply clarity. At 3 in the morning I rose, not with urgency but with the same quiet ritual I did when the night was heavy. I poured another cup of tea, sat by the window that overlooks the lane and the 2 maples that throw loose coins of light across the porch, and I wrote a list. The list was not a how-to, it was a ledger of intention. The first item said, retrieve deed, done. The second, call Andrew, done. The third, gather recent statements. The handwriting was small and deliberate. My list looked like a map, and following it felt like learning to walk again, an old woman on measured feet. Morning came gray and polite. The house still smelled faintly of peach and detergent. There is a particular calm to early mornings when the rest of the household thinks they have more time than the day allows. It is a moment where action can move in silence.
I dressed in the beige blazer I keep for meetings, a neutral armor, and chose shoes that would not scuff the hardwood. I did not dress for war, I dressed for work. Roman arrived before his boss. He was young in the way of people who have yet to learn that the world softens around older hands. He carried a leather portfolio and a respectable pair of shoes. He came up the walk and knocked with a kind of professional rhythm. I let him in, handed him the deed and the list I had made, and asked him to read through the papers while I brewed coffee. He did, and his eyebrows moved the right way when he found the lines we needed. He left with the notice prepared, walking back to his car with the sort of purpose one sees in men carrying groceries for elderly neighbors. Later that morning, a knock sounded at the door, and when I opened it, there he was in a modest suit, a young man with a soft voice and a folder that carried the weight of a morning's worth of decisions. He handed me the receipt of service, the kind of paper that feels like a small, impossible thing. Served. He folded his hands politely and said, "Miss Everson, Mr. Sterling sends his regards." I thanked him and watched him go down the walk with the legal weight relieved from his shoulders and placed where it belonged. That piece of paper, the notice terminating the gratuitous use of the property, was not a weapon in the theatrical sense. It was a schedule and a reality. It set a deadline, 30 days in general terms, a period to disentangle a life that had become braided and confused. Within the envelope sat instructions written in clear, calm language. The occupancy was no longer permitted. The owner sought the return of quiet possession, and the mediator would assist if desired. The words were plain. They had no malice in them. They simply existed as the formal statement of one person's decision. Derek found the paper like an insult with edges. He picked it up in the living room when Lena was not there, and read aloud the legal phrasing with the kind of incredulous disbelief that expects paperwork to appease. "This is nothing," he told me later at the small table in the kitchen, where the kettle steamed and the sun was doing the polite work of gilding the countertop. He was loud, but he was also aware. His voice had the restless tone of a man who knows his bluff is being checked. "You can speak to a lawyer," he said. "You can file anything you like, but," he tapped the paper with a finger as if it were an insect, "you can't kick me out." I did not answer him that day. Instead, I called the utility company. It felt oddly powerful and only mildly vengeful to say calmly, "I am the account holder. I want to suspend service pending verification." The woman on the other end of the phone asked the necessary verification questions and made the necessary notes. I gave her my birthday, my current address, and the last 4 digits of the account that had paid for the gas in March. The clerk's voice was quietly assisting. It had none of the grand drama of courtroom scenes, and I preferred it that way. It was just a ledger entry turning a page. I also called the issuing bank and asked to put a temporary freeze on cards issued in my name that I did not recognize on the statements. There was no triumph in the clerk's procedural tone, only the satisfaction that comes when a plan works as designed. A suspected card was declined at the corner store that afternoon. Derek returned home that night and discovered a card would not work for a tank of gas he had planned to buy. It was a small friction, but it shifted something in the household's daily rhythm. These were not acts of spite, they were acts of disentangling. Having supervised record after record, I had watched small errors compound into catastrophe. A credit line opened in a parent's name can become a quiet conduit for a stranger's future. A signature left unchecked can be the hinge on which lives twist. I did what I could to restore the boundaries that had worn thin. Lena saw me differently after that. She came home the day Roman served the notice. She was carrying a grocery bag, her eyes like someone learning to use a tool for the first time. We sat at the kitchen table with green tea. Her hands trembled, more with the relief that someone had begun to act than with any shame. She asked me how the process would go. I told her plainly that with Andrew's office handling the legal side, we were no longer improvising. She listened as if someone had set down a route on a map for her. "I felt so trapped," she said, and the admission sounded to me like the first small clearing in a dense path. She told me about moments when Derek had laughed at her suggestions or told her she couldn't manage small things like paying a bill without him. She told me about nights she woke up and checked her phone to see if her husband had texted her back. Her voice was softened by weariness, but not broken. We went to the mall the next afternoon. It is a small domestic ritual, dressing for new roles.
I needed a blazer that read prepared and not matronly. I wanted something neutral, efficient. Clothes have a way of changing your posture by inviting a different gait. Lena watched as I tried on a jacket and made a small joke about my taking fashion advice from a department store clerk with hair like a sculpture. She laughed, and the sound was all at once the thing that can make the world bearable, and the thing that shows how long it had been since she had laughed. Meanwhile, Andrew called to say the notice had been served. Roman had made sure.
He explained, over the phone and with the careful economy of someone who has placed many facts into order, what would happen next and the lodestar terms that mattered. The notice would create an official record of termination. If we had to proceed further, there would be a legal process for regaining possession, and in the meantime, protective measures could be taken to secure accounts and keys. He did not promise miracles or immediate triumphs. He said what lawyers say when preparing people for a process: we will proceed with the facts and the documents. There were small tactical moves we made that were not dramatic but proved effective. We changed passwords on email accounts registered under my name, passwords I had not looked at in years, and removed stored payment methods tied to convenience services. We listed the vehicle in my name for insurance updates. Andrew's office handled a polite letter to the bank inquiring about the wire transfer I had mentioned. That letter was a professional nudge that begins the process of paper tracking in an institution built to respond to requests with forms. We did not try to shame anyone. We simply established the presence of an official request. Friends arrived like understated sentries. Zoe brought lemon bars that tasted of childhood, and Betty came with a stack of index cards and a practical notebook that had been through 2 marriages and a dozen wills. Olga, who lives 2 doors down, arrived with a thermos of coffee and a political optimism that is mostly humor disguised as hope. They did not protest or scream. They came and sat in the living room, their presence both a comfort and a reminder that home is more than one person's fight. They listened without judgment when I told them the facts, and checked in with Lena the way women of a neighborhood do, quietly, with offering hands and not too many questions. At some point, Derek started to forget his bluster when confronted with quiet paper. There is an odd economy to bureaucracy. People who yell cannot often answer an itemized list of dates. He was loud when he arrived at the attorney's office for the first conference. He came with the practiced theatricality of someone who believes volume can substitute for argument. I sat across the table from him and watched Andrew do what he does best: translate human noise into legal logic. "You need not be ashamed to speak calmly," Andrew said to Derek at one point, the tone of a man who has taught deputies for years. "We can discuss ownership and rights without theatrics." Derek bristled. He tried to present the usual line, that Lena's life had been intertwined with him for years, that he had contributed, that to remove him would be unjust. The room held the kind of concentrated politeness I have seen in municipal hearings. People pressed to find dignity in the presence of formalities. Roman was there as well, crisp with his folder. He placed a copy of the notice on the table between us.
He described, practically, that legal notice had been given and that a timeline had begun. He spoke with the sort of respect younger colleagues show when they have learned to treat older clients with a balance of professionalism and compassion. Derek interrupted with a threat, loud, stupid, and exposed, and answered with a nonchalant precision that took the heat out of it. "If you have claims," he said, "we will see those in the proper forum. The first step is to respect the notice." What startled me that afternoon was not Derek's anger. It was the way the papers forced the household's true accounting to the surface. Andrew asked a simple question: "Ask the bank for your statements," and the answer came back without the ritual of defensiveness. The so-called savings Derek had promised Lena existed mostly in a narrative he told to bolster his position. The bank statements showed otherwise. There were transactions that did not match the story. A wire transfer that had been represented as savings for emergencies had been routed elsewhere. The numbers were not dramatic in a cinematic sense, but they were damning in the way numbers nearly always are: clear, impartial, unforgiving. Derek's face went from red to an odd ashen color I did not expect. He tried to explain with 1,000 little half-truths: expenses paid, loans paid, investments rearranged. But the ledger remained. Paper does not admit to nuances of feeling. It simply records. On the attorney's gray conference table, the numbers were laid out like a map of what had happened. Derek had nowhere to hide the gap between his words and the bank's ledgers. Lena's expression shifted from confusion to a kind of careful focus that I recognized from the first time she learned to read a budget in high school. There is an awakening one sees sometimes, when facts line up and the fog lifts. Her hands trembled as she held a printed statement. She looked at Derek as if seeing him anew, with the same sort of sober study I might give to a document I was cross-referencing. The rage and the drama that have occupied this house for months condensed into a piece of paper that did not lie. And still, nothing was triumphant. The notice only began a count. The legal process can be patient in its way.
the kind of patience that strips the theater from life and leaves only the invoices and the signatures. Andrew explained softly what could come next and what would be required if Derek contested. He mentioned mediation, the possibility of a court process. He emphasized, as lawyers do when they want to keep expectations grounded, that documents and counsel would guide our course. I nodded. We were moving forward, but cross a single administrative boundary and the world could still complicate matters. That night I went home and locked the door behind me, the key in my hand, a small physical fact to hang the world on.
I brewed tea and sat for a long time in the armchair, the green velvet holding the imprint of my body like an old witness. The house smelled faintly of lemon and old books. I thought of my husband, who used to say that things are only safe when they have been accounted for, and I felt a sudden tenderness for the domestic arithmetic that keeps life stable. Owning a house had always been pragmatic for us. Licenses, taxes, the order of paperwork. Tonight, it was sentimental. Tonight I counted every paper and felt their significance deepen. People ask me sometimes why I chose silence in the hallway that day. They imagine a scene of violence avoided or a personal affront swallowed under the weight of dignity. The truth is simpler. Shouting would not have changed the ledger. I kept my voice because I had a different instrument at hand. I had paperwork, a professional friend in Andrew, a young man who could serve notice with no drama, and neighbors who brought lemon bars. I had, in short, the precise, unromantic tools that preserve dignity. The morning after the meeting with the lawyer, life at the house felt taut, like a frame with a new picture inside it. Practical things were being sorted, utilities clearly in my name, important accounts secured, a list of passwords moved into a locked box in my bedroom. Lena came by, and together we sat, making a small inventory. Keys, insurance policies, bank contact numbers, a file of medical directives. We wrote them out in neat columns that I could have made into a ledger for the county office. The act of listing is an act of reclaiming. Names on a page can be a slow kind of victory. The day Roman served the notice, I did something that surprised even me. I left. Not in a dramatic exit with a car buzzing and a bag of clothes. I packed a small overnight bag, put on a sweater that had belonged to my husband, and went to the little day spa he had once joked was a frivolity for people who can find time. I sat under a hot towel and let steam pull the knots from my neck. It was not indulgence. It was a deliberate act of absence. I did not want to be there the day movers arrived, if movers arrived. I had watched similar scenes where owners and the people they were separating from stood across rooms like two halves of a broken picture frame. I did not want wrath or revenge. I wanted the quiet act of restoration to be my first memory when I returned. From the soft chair of that spa, I thought of the paradox that had always amused me. Silence becomes its own language when spoken widely enough. The house needed work, not war. I knew lugging boxes out of a home to be performed by others as a kind of erosion. I wanted to avoid seeing my life unpackaged like that. Instead, I chose to come back once the hard business had settled into paperwork and the doorways had stopped echoing. When I came home, the house felt different. There was a kind of administrative hush.
Paper had done what paper always does. It reframed human confusion into formal clarity. Boxes had been moved from the living room to a truck at the curb. A neighbor had called to say the men were careful and efficient. I found the place where Derek had slept, if sleeping is what he did there, and I opened the windows. The air moved through like a physical exhale. I scrubbed the countertops myself, a meditation in dish soap and hot water, and put the kettle on as if to assert normal routines. Lena visited that evening and sat at the kitchen table with me. The conversation between us was not dramatic. It was measured. She told me she was thinking of renting an apartment downtown, small and light-filled. She said quietly that she would be seeking legal counsel for divorce. I held her hand across the table and felt the small tremor of strength and fear. She was doing what people do when they choose their own lives, stepping forward with some trepidation and a careful luggage of hope. We did not celebrate. We cleaned. We painted a single accent wall in peach, a color Lena had always loved and I had always allowed as a small rebellion. Painting the wall was ordinary and decisive, a brushstroke of control that felt like a prayer. Each swipe of color covered something small and persistent, the marks where a chair had scraped too many times, fingerprints that belonged to other lives. The peach dried like a soft promise. The story did not end there. There were meetings and calls to make, a few tense phone conversations, and nights when sleep would not come because the ledger still contained questions. There was the quiet work of restoring passwords and telling friends to use mailed invitations rather than texts when privacy mattered. There were new routines, the kettle always on, my favorite record playing softly in the living room as I cooked a simple dinner, the green velvet armchair holding me as I read the papers Andrew sent and compared them like a woman checking the work of a craftsman. There was also the slow task of teaching. One afternoon, I put together a small meeting in my living room. I called Betty, Zoe, and Olga and asked them to bring their neighbors. We sat at my kitchen table, each woman with a cup of tea and a little notebook. I offered them the simple list I had made: deed location, bank contact, passwords, an emergency contact person, and a safe place to keep keys. They laughed at first. Women of our age find talk of passwords amusing in the way people laugh at learning to use a smartphone. But by the end, there were serious nods and quiet notes being taken. The conversation was practical and unshowy. It did what small groups of women have always done: exchange tools and keep one another from falling. In that way, the house reknit itself. Ownership, I have come to believe, is less about the deed and more about the steady worker who tends the edges. Boundaries are not a single heroic act. They are a series of small administrative tasks.
They are a cup of tea put down on a table and followed by a clear list. But the ledger still had unsolved lines. The bank's inquiries had unearthed movement that needed more scrutiny. Andrew promised we would trace the wire and follow the paperwork where it led. He said the language of finance could sometimes be like a maze, inaccessible to those unfamiliar with its corridors, but not impenetrable. We would follow the paper trail, he said, with the patience of people who work with facts. There remained, too, Derek's bluster. He had not yet packed all his things when I returned. There were gestures he made that looked like bargaining. He tried to reframe the terms, as if love and need could be contracted as easily as utilities. He implied things in the softest possible threats. If I pursued this, if I insisted, what would it mean for family dinners and birthdays? It was a moral calculus that excuses cruelty because it is convenient. One evening, when the lights had been turned down to the level I prefer and I was sitting with a small stack of ledgers, Derek came into the kitchen and asked to talk. Lena was not there. He spoke slowly, as if choosing the correct cadence could unpick a knot. "We can work this out," he said. "You don't need to take everything to the lawyers." I set my teacup down with an exactness that did not invite negotiation. "What I have taken to lawyers," I said, "is what you would call a final notice. It is a statement of ownership and an invitation to leave with dignity." I said the words as if reading from a modest manual, and perhaps I was. He fumbled and then left, the door closing behind him with the predictable thud of someone who has learned that words sometimes do the work their fists could not. There are nights when I wake and think of all the things I have learned. Lessons about money and marriage, about the traps of combination locks and the necessity of separate bank accounts. The quiet work of restoration is not always grand. Sometimes it is the small arranging of the bookshelf, the moving of the picture frame, the decision to keep the kettle on the stove where anyone can reach for a cup. It is the ritual of putting things in their rightful place. I will say this plainly: the lawyer's arrival the next morning did not solve everything in a melodramatic sweep. It created a framework we could work within. It stopped some of Derek's immediate theatrics and transformed them into a business-like dispute. It gave me the space to breathe and the authority to name wrongs. It did not turn back time or conjure missing money from thin air. It asked me to do the tedious, ordinary work of aligning facts and following through. But on a practical level, once paper and counsel stepped in, the world started to reassemble itself into the shape it should have been. Doors that had been slammed now opened and closed politely. Men with moving trucks traded boxes with less hostility than people. Lena began to sleep through part of the night that had once been all hunger and worry. My neighbors learned the small rituals that help keep a home secure. Still, the story was not finished. That is why I sat at my kitchen table the night before the next court calendar and made a more detailed list. Find missing wire, inventory of items removed, contact for the mattress company, documents for insurance. I crossed items off and added more. I found in that small ritual the same clear mind I used when I handled record requests, the satisfaction of a problem being reduced to a list of tasks. The next morning, Andrew asked to convene one more meeting. He wanted Derek and Lena to come in and see the numbers laid out in full. He asked me to bring the copies I had made. Roman would be there to take notes and make sure the service had been properly recorded. I dressed again in my neutral blazer, smoothed my hair, and left the house with the keys jingling like a new password. We met in a room with a table the color of a polished walnut and a wall with framed certificates that were as understated and precise as the law. Derek arrived with the kind of swagger men adopt when they imagine they still own illusions of grandeur.
Lena came with a quiet resolve, clutching a small leather notebook. Roman sat with his pen ready. Andrew laid the bank statements and the other documents on the table like an orderly map. He explained once more what each paper said, and then, most piercingly, he translated the numbers into the language Derek had used at home, that supposed savings had been exhausted, that transfers were unaccounted for, and that the ledger showed discrepancies. What happened next was not the end. It did not get solved in one neat scene, but as Derek tried to recast the facts, the numbers on the table held steady. He found his voice pitching upward, much like a man discovering that volume cannot drown paper. He reached the edges of his patience. He made a threat, the kind that is meant to frighten more than to hurt. In that moment, something in me, soft and old, hardened into a clarity I have kept for myself. "Mr. Evans," Andrew said to him, a name he did not use lightly. "If you have evidence to support your claims, bring them forward. If you do not, you will be expected to comply with the notice." Derek leaned back in his chair, and his face, which had been a fierce red moments before, slid into a pale sort of worry. He stammered a thank you and left like a man whose bluff is called in a quiet room. I sat at the table and folded my hands. The room felt like a place where truth had been asked to sit up straight. Roman collected the copies and promised to file them. Andrew suggested a small pause, to allow the immediate shock to settle and to encourage rational decisions. I was grateful for the pause. It allowed a breath between the act and the consequence, between the paper and the life. We walked back to our cars in a cool, unshowy state.
Lena took my arm at the curb and squeezed it. "Thank you," she said, but she was not asking for gratitude. She was acknowledging the work of a woman who had come into a hallway and chosen not to raise her voice. She had chosen paper instead. That evening, I sat once more in the green velvet chair with the kettle on and music at a level I chose. I thought about the way silence had served me, the heavy silence of papers, the kind of absence that organizes rather than harms. I wrote in my notebook, in small, precise letters, a plan for the coming days. Check-in with neighbors, inventory of what had been taken, follow-up letter to the bank, and a small workshop I intended to hold to teach other women the same few measures that had brought me this far. But even as I wrote, I felt the pulse of unfinished business. There were questions about where the transfers had gone and whether Derek would contest with more than words. There was the human grief of watching a daughter hurt and the hard work of staying close while insisting on boundaries. There was the matter of dignity, which sometimes requires paperwork to be upheld. I knew the coming days would need patience and a stubborn persistence. When I switched the lamp off that night, the room held a hush that was neither victory nor defeat. It was merely room at rest after a day of measured labor. I read a page from a book I had loved for years, folded the corner back, and for a moment felt the normal, small happiness of being in a space that, by statute and by habit, belonged to me. The kettle was quiet on the stove, the keys were on the nightstand, and the papers were filed where they belonged. The next morning, before dawn had fully settled, my phone buzzed with a short message from Roman. He had a new development. He asked if I could come by Andrew's office before 9. I put on my blazer and picked up the deed from the bed where I had left it. Lena called as I was about to leave, her voice steady, a small answer to all the confusion. "I'll be there," she said. "We'll go together." I walked to the car with the keys making the small jingle that has become for me as reassuring as a password. It was a sound that indicated a life accounted for. I drove to the lawyer's office, the city waking up around me. In the glove compartment, I kept the small envelope with the deed in it, a relic and a proof. When I arrived, Roman met me at the door with a look that folded in 2 parts, urgency and relief. He led me into the same conference room where we had gathered before. Andrew was already there, and Derek sat across the table with a face like someone who had not slept long enough to undo his anxiety. Andrew looked up and a room steadied. He slid a paper across to me. Bank correspondence, recent and precise. My eyes followed the numbers and lines until a single phrase stood out, plain as a bell. An unauthorized transfer, a recipient whose account ledger had been shadowed. The new information suggested something more complicated than mismanagement. It suggested movement that would require further investigation. Derek's mouth opened. He swore softly, a private oath. He had expected the confrontation to be, in the worst case, an inconvenience. He had not expected the ledger to show a path that could be traced, step by recorded step. He had not expected that a paper trail could be resilient enough to resist his bluster. The room held its breath. I did not. I folded my hands and felt the small solidity of the deed in my bag at my side, an old woman's anchor. The next steps would be procedural and slow, as Andrew said, but for the first time since the door slammed closed, the facts were aligning in a way I could trust.
but for the first time since the door slammed closed, the facts were aligning in a way I could trust. Andrew put the new correspondence in front of us and let the paper sit, unremarkable and then suddenly weighty, like a stone dropped into a pond. Roman folded his hands and made a notation. Lena's notebook was open. She had already underlined the phrase that mattered most: unauthorized transfer. The words are not melodramatic, but they are surgical. They carve out what happened without needing to shout. What the bank is telling us, Andrew said, is that this transfer did not follow the pattern of the account's typical transactions. That tells us two things. First, that someone took liberties with the account, and second, that the movement can be traced. He did not use the word triumph. Lawyers are careful with nouns that promise irreversible change. He used instead the cool instrument of method. We will request more records. We will ask for timestamps, beneficiary information. That will give us a clearer picture of where the funds moved. Derek's mouth opened and closed like a bird trying to find a tune. He said something about investments and joint decisions, the rhetorical stock a man uses when he needs narrative to cover arithmetic. Andrew slid another paper across the table. "If you have receipts, produce them," he said. "If you do not, we will proceed on the basis of the documents we have. The bank will cooperate with a formal request." There was a civility to the sentence that hid the fact it could lead to discomfort for someone who had treated numbers as suggestions. Derek left the office that afternoon with a posture that hinted at retreat. I watched him from the curb until he turned the corner. Then I exhaled in a way that felt like the release of a small animal from a trap. It was not triumph. It was relief and a recognition that slow work had begun to show itself as its own kind of authority. Over the next 2 weeks, the house settled into a rhythm that made me feel like the engineer of an orchestra rather than its roaring conductor. Andrew's office sent letters that requested the bank's full disclosure. They asked for copies of that wire's routing, the timestamps, the names attached to any receiving account. I read each page as if it were a page from the ledger of my own life, annotating with a pencil, because that is how I read things. Measure, compare, and mark. The bank's reply came in stages: a careful letter acknowledging the inquiry, an initial set of transaction copies, and finally an alert that a particular receiving account had been identified and would be subject to a review for possible unauthorized receipt. They did not promise the moon. Banks do not. They promised process. Even that was enough. Process is what gives order to nights when fear wants to get louder. Derek became quieter in the house. There were still mutters and the occasional clattering of pots, but the full-throated performance of his earlier stage had dampened. Perhaps he had expected law to be loud and immediate, like a gavel dropped on a foot. He did not account for the slow, uncelebrated, and very methodical way paper constricts a person's options. Lena changed too. If in earlier weeks she had been a willow caught in a wind of someone else's choices, she now seemed firmer, rooted more than rigid. She came to the kitchen and asked simple, useful questions about bills and statements. She asked how things had been done before, and when I answered in the language of dates and account names, she would nod and take notes with a seriousness that belonged to a woman assembling her own life. Once, when a phone call interrupted our conversation, I saw her breathe differently after she hung up. She had made a payment in her name for the first time in months. It was only $20 to a utility that had been in dispute, but the small invoice slid across like a seed. We had more meetings with Andrew. Sometimes Roman led them and wrote down the questions we needed to ask next. Andrew's temperament remained the same, a blade under silk. He explained the legal options and their likely durations. He set expectations in the temperate voice of someone who knows that speed is not always justice. We did not rush him. We gave him the facts. He gave us process. It is a tidy exchange, and sometimes tidy is what keeps you from unraveling. There were moments that surprised me, little domestic scenes that had no legal bearing and everything to do with human repair. Betty stopped by with a notebook and a frown I have learned to respect. She had been listening from her house 2 doors down and wanted to make sure her nephew, who had taken an unusual interest in her checking account, had no access she had not given. We sat at my kitchen table, and I taught her the simple idea of separation. Keep your accounts in your name, keep your signature with you, make a list and keep it in a locked place. She laughed at the novelty of talking about passwords, but she also wrote them down, careful and deliberate. Olga arrived with coffee and the single-minded cheer that has sustained neighborhoods for generations. She has a knack for converting fear into casseroles, which I respect. Zoe brought lemon bars, and the afternoon fell into a pattern of food and small talk, and a kind of practical tutoring that is low on drama and high on result. We did not hold a lecture. We held a kitchen table meeting.
That kind of learning is practical and, more importantly, comfortable enough for women to ask honest questions. Outside of the house, Andrew's quiet pressure began to nudge the ledger. The bank provided a deeper set of records. They identified a chain of accounts and a vendor-like recipient that did not match any explanation Derek offered. With each document, the picture of what had been done grew less fuzzy and more like a map. A wire that was said to pad a savings account did not rest in a savings envelope. It moved. Where it landed mattered less to me than the fact that the trail existed and could be followed. One afternoon, Roman called to say the bank had flagged a possible unauthorized routing and had initiated an internal review. He suggested we be patient while that review unfolded. I have learned that patience in legal matters is not an absence of action, but a steady insistence on facts. I prepared supper, set the table, and put out 2 plates because someone would be joining me that evening. The act of ordinary domesticity steadies more than any argument. The house began to mend in small ways. I took to walking the floors at dawn with a dust cloth and a sense of ritual. I put fresh tea bags in a tin and labeled it guest and friends. I found the little brass key to the cedar chest and opened it. Inside were photographs, a silver napkin ring with my husband's initials, a box of pressed roses he had kept, and a set of receipts for things we had bought when we were younger and less undecided. I sat on the floor with the chest lid across my knees and let the sun move across the wood. It is strange how the weight of paper and the weight of memory can be held together in the same moment without one canceling the other. There were small irritations. A delivery man tried to insist that Derek sign for a parcel that arrived for him after the notice. I refused to become entangled in tempers. I spoke plainly to the delivery clerk. It's addressed to him, but the occupancy has changed. We can file a form here. He looked as surprised as any non-regular buyer of paperwork. I felt like a translator of small legal etiquette. I handed over my ID with the calm of someone who speaks the language of records. And then one morning, Roman called with a sentence that made my hands go slightly cold. We have an update. The bank has completed an initial review. They've placed an alert on the recipient account and referred the file for further investigation. He didn't make promises. He didn't need to. He had said the important phrase, referral for further investigation.
That is the moment a ledger moves from static fiction toward accountability. We began to see a change in Derek's behavior that had nothing to do with remorse and everything to do with diminishing options. He packed a few boxes one morning when the sun was still low. He was clumsy with the packing, like a man packing up the idea of himself. He left a guitar he never played on its stand and a stack of mismatched socks. He left a note on the kitchen counter that was more a list of groceries than an apology. I did not read it closely. Sometimes words left behind are less important than the act of leaving itself. When he finally decided to move out, no melodramatic exit, no van with slogans, he did it in a cadence that matched the person he had become, practical and abrupt. He hired a truck by himself and left early one morning. The movers were efficient and careful. They wrapped a lamp that had been his mother's in brown paper and carried it down the path. I was not there. I had made the decision earlier to avoid the scene. I wanted the memory of his leaving to be quiet, like the closing of a book I had read once and set aside. After the truck left, there was a peculiar silence. The house had space in it that belonged not to vacancy, but to a new possibility. I opened the windows and let the fresh air move through the rooms in a way that felt like a physical exhale. I set the kettle on, and the tea I made that afternoon tasted of Triumph and dish soap and almond extract. It was a strange domestic blend that suited the hour. Lena moved forward in measured steps. She found an apartment downtown, small, bright, and with a window that faced the city's slow pulse. She signed a lease, paid the deposit with money she had saved from work and a few small, honest loans from friends who believed in her more than a ledger did. I helped her choose a couch that did not take up the whole living room. We took measurements, made lists, and bought plants that would not demand too much attention. Watching her put the key in the door for the first time in her name was a private and substantial joy. We did not speak much about divorce at first. Lena needed to understand her finances and then her reasons. She began seeing a counselor, and with that help, she also began the legal process that would untangle marriage papers from house papers. I stayed close, offering the practical, copies of statements, phone numbers for lawyers Andrew recommended for family cases, a sharp pencil, and the patience to list everything. She used my small spare room as her planning office, and sometimes we would eat cereal there late at night and laugh at the ridiculous things men say when they believe themselves indispensable.
The bank's deeper review unfolded in the way that large institutions unfold things, methodically and with an air of officialness that can be soothing.
They requested more information, which Andrew supplied, and another letter arrived that suggested the possibility of recovering some funds. Again, no promises. Recoveries, the bank's correspondent said, can take time and depend on the cooperation of multiple parties. I wrote that down in a notebook and underlined the word time twice. Little victories became the small stones of our new days. The utility accounts were firmly in my name, and the monthly auto payments were reestablished under our newly cleared access. I sat with a stack of receipts and reconciled the statements in a way that felt like mending a torn hem. The house felt like a garment that had been restitched. At the same time, there was work to be done on the softer interior spaces. We painted the accent wall in the living room that evening, a peach that read warm in the light and made the green velvet chair look younger. I took the brush in hand and painted for a while, long strokes that made a tidy line between old marks and new surface. Lena did 2 corners. The simple move of adding color felt ritualistic. When the paint dried, the room read differently. It was not only brighter, but had a tone of insistence, as if the color itself were declaring that this house would hold what the deed promised, a place aligned with its owner. Then I put together the workshop. The idea had started as a note on the back of an envelope and grew into a plan that fit into my living room like a puzzle. I invited Betty, Zoe, Olga, and a few other women I had met at the library and the clinic. I made lemon bars and brewed more tea. I printed the list I had used for myself: where deeds can be found, the idea of keeping copies, the notion of a secure password list kept offline, the value of a trusted attorney's contact information, and I added a few practical elements: how to check your name on a deed, the importance of separate banking for accounts you want protected, and the simple principle that ownership must be document-backed. I made sure to say one important thing at the start. This is not legal advice. It is a compilation of what I had learned and what had helped me. For anything that needs legal enforcement, talk to an attorney. That small sentence kept the room practical and honest. The women laughed, took notes, and then asked questions I had not thought to include, about the way utilities should be handled when a partner moves out, about how to keep a password manager if you were never a fan of technology, about whom to name as an emergency contact. We answered by combining the knowledge of a retired county recorder and the practical sense of 30 years of neighborly wisdom. Betty told a story then about a cousin who had been coaxed to sign a document and later regretted it. She had the look of someone trying to make sense of the world and refusing to be its passive recipient.
We talked about wills, and I told them in plain language why a will mattered, not in melodramatic terms, but as a simple way to keep a home from becoming someone else's convenient narrative. There were tears, yes, and there was laughter. There were also practical takeaways. 3 women agreed to meet and review each other's lists, and one neighbor promised to write out where her deed was stored and tuck it in a safety deposit box. One of the most surprising parts of the workshop was how much people wanted to share tactics that worked for them. Betty had a small accordion folder labeled Home, which she showed with pride. Olga had a system of trusted phone numbers written on a card she kept in her purse. Zoe, who had been quiet all afternoon, stood up at the end and said she had a friend who had been through a similar situation and would come to speak to the group next week. The room hummed with the quiet power of shared practical knowledge. As the weeks turned to months, the legal paper continued its patient work. Andrew filed a formal request for more records. Roman made careful copies. The bank's investigators worked in their offices with their own brand of procedural calm. I did not think about revenge. I thought instead about retracing steps, where the transfers went, which card had been used for what, whether receipts matched. It is the work I had always done. Follow paper until you find the corner that holds the story. One day Roman called with a neutral tone that suggested something significant without performance. The bank had located a portion of the transferred funds in another account. It was a modest recovery, not a cinematic return of a fortune, but it was a physical fact that a few $1,000s had been frozen pending verification. That is not justice in a poetic sense. It is an accounting response. Yet it felt meaningful. It meant that something that had been taken could be reconciled, at least partially, by being traced. Derek in the months that followed remained in the periphery of our lives. He sent a few text messages asking for items he had left behind, and a few emails suggesting that he would contest certain statements. Andrew advised caution and measured replies. Lena did not want to be entangled in further negotiations. She had decided to move forward. It is a strange thing, the way people choose the life they will have and the collusion of small decisions that make it possible. She called me one night from her new apartment and read me a menu of things she had ordered for her first dinner: an inexpensive pan, a set of dish towels, a plant. She sounded like a woman putting together a map.
In the evenings, when I was alone, I found myself returning to small rituals my husband and I had kept. I set the kettle on, I dusted the shelves, I arranged the books by the little system we had developed, poetry with fiction, biographies in their own pile. The house settled into a quieter rhythm that made room for new things.
There was no trumpeting of victory. There was the steady hum of a life being reassembled with honest tools. Months later, when the bank's review had run its course and the legal work had been filed, Andrew called me into his office for a brief meeting. He was pleased with the clarity of the paper trail and with the way Lena had begun to assert herself. He was careful to remind me that not all questions had answers and that not all funds could be recovered. He was also clear that the formal notice we had served had created a record that supported our position. He mentioned mediation as a possible step if Derek wanted to pursue contestation. I nodded. We had taken the path of method and patience. We would continue to follow it. By then, my living room had become a small center for helpful things. Women came for tea and left with lists. Men who had previously been absent from their own household management began to ask questions about how to set up a simple record system for their parents. A young couple brought over a cake and asked about wills, their hands full of timing and plans. I was not preaching, I was teaching the things that had saved me: clarity, separation of accounts, the good sense to keep copies in a locked place, and the humility to ask for counsel. Lena walked into my house one afternoon in late summer with a box of photographs. "I'm ready," she said. She was not asking permission, she was announcing an intention. She had a job she liked, a small social circle in her neighborhood, and a cottage plant thriving on the windowsill. She had given me a little gift, a faded postcard of the town where we had once taken a summer trip. We drank tea and looked at pictures of a beach the color of milk glass, and of a younger Lena who wore her hair differently. We talked about things that had nothing to do with law or accounts, and everything to do with the slow work of becoming oneself. There was still the ledger to close. Andrew's office pursued recovery where possible. The bank kept us informed. The legal notice stood as a document in the file of the county. My name, my deed, my decision. The house had returned to its life of small routines: laundry on Wednesdays, a radio station in the evenings, the careful replacement of a light bulb when it went out. I kept a list in my bedside drawer of things to do, small administrative tasks that would keep the space orderly. On a quiet Thursday, I crossed off an item, changed the spare key's hiding place. It felt absurdly satisfying. On another evening, I rearranged the bookshelf so that my husband's books sat with mine rather than face away in separate piles. I found a small comfort in the book spines aligned, as if two lives that had once run parallel could, in a small domestic way, converge. And then there were the unremarkable pleasures. Lena called with a recipe she had tried. Betty came over to show me the new folder she had labeled home. Olga announced a neighborhood potluck.
These things do not make the news. They do not go into bank files. They are nonetheless the real measures of recovery, the soft instruments that stitch a life into something usable. One day I stood at the kitchen sink with the window open and watched a neighborhood child ride a bike past the house. I thought about the way boundaries can be taught through small acts: a lid placed back on a pan, a bill paid on time, a key that is kept by one person and only lent with consent. I thought also about silence. People assume that silence is weakness. In my case, it was the opposite. It was a decision to withhold an immediate emotional reaction in favor of a steadier, more effective one. I stayed silent in the hallway that day, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had other instruments to use: paper, counsel, and the deliberate doing of small, sensible things. The house is mine now in the ways that matter: the deed in the drawer, the electricity in my name, the address that is the place of my waking. It is not a fortress. It is a lived-in space with new curtains and a faint scent of peach from the jar of preserves Lena brought me after she moved out. The green velvet armchair still bears my imprint. The peach wall glows with measured light. These are little things, but they are entire. Sometimes people ask if I harbor bitterness. The truth is complex. There is sadness for the younger years lost to small betrayals. There is also equanimity and a practical gratitude for the tools that brought me here. I have a dignity I keep not as a trophy, but as a day-to-day posture: keys in my pocket, the kettle warmed when I want it, my phone with my attorney's number saved under A. Sterling. I keep a small notebook where I list things to teach at my next meeting. I am not triumphant so much as steady. At the end, I found myself doing what I always do: cataloging, making a list, sharing it with a neighbor. In late autumn, I scheduled another kitchen table workshop. We met, and I brought paper copies of the checklist I had used for Lena: where to store deeds, a place to keep a list of passwords offline, the value of separate accounts for essential bills, and the helpfulness of having an attorney's contact ready. We spoke quietly, and then we ate lemon bars, and the afternoon felt like a practical church, people coming together to keep one another from falling. Before I close this account, there is one simple detail I want to keep for myself and perhaps for you. When a house is truly yours, you feel it in small things. You feel it in how you choose the radio station. You feel it in deciding, at last, that the living room would be painted peach because it made you breathe easier. You feel it in the quiet order of your paperwork. You feel it in the sound of the key on the nightstand, jangling as if it were a password you had remembered at last.
The night before the first winter storm came through, Lena and I sat on the couch with a blanket across our knees and drank chamomile tea. The kettle had been on and off that day many times, small domestic bells. We listened to a record I had not played in years. The needle found the groove like a cat finding a sunny spot. We talked about the future in that way women do, with small jokes and careful plans. She opened a drawer and took out a tiny ring her grandmother had left her, a thing she said she wanted to keep with her. I told her to keep it, and then I showed her where in my files her own paperwork was copied and labeled for safekeeping until she settled into her new life more firmly. She squeezed my hand, and we both laughed at the extravagance of our own carefulness. If I have learned anything from this experience, it is a series of small, plain truths: that silence can be a posture of agency, that documents have teeth when backed by counsel, that neighbors keep each other safer than any one person can alone, and that dignity is preserved in the mundane, by a list crossed off, by a kettle set to boil, by a paintbrush laid down clean. I do not ask for applause. I ask only for the practical wisdom of being prepared and the courage to call upon help when it is needed. He slammed the door and said, "Leave." I stayed silent until the lawyer arrived the next morning. That morning made a way. The rest of it, months of small, steady work, made a life. If this story resonated with you, please share it in the comments and tell us one boundary you've set or a small practical step you've taken to keep a home safe. If you'd like more true life stories about quiet resilience, subscribe and come back for the next cup of tea.